Welcome. My name is Philip Mondor, President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada, an industry organization with a mandate aimed at building a world-leading tourism workforce. Tourism HR Canada facilitates, coordinates, and enables human resource development activities that support a globally competitive and sustainable industry and foster the development of a dynamic and resilient workforce. Welcome to today's webinar, called Adapting to New Market Realities. Today's focus will be on the marketing and communications of your businesses. This webinar will help small businesses revisit their strategies to align products and services with new and different markets. This session will include tips on developing sales and marketing plans for new markets. There are several topics from TourismRecovery.ca that we will be building on, some from the category of strategy and other from the category of marketing. Today's webinar will be 1 hour in duration. It is recorded and it will be available for your viewing pleasure following today's session from our website. The PDF copy will also be available for download. The PowerPoint deck that we are presenting today will include URL links to everything we feature here, so you can go deeper or check in on any topic that might pique your interest. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to this webinar series and other related tools. Our website contains more information. You can always go to TourismRecovery.ca for additional resources. Heather and John from our team are monitoring the Q&A and chat features. We welcome you to raise any questions we may have along the way. They will do their best to keep up with those inquiries. If we are unable to answer all of those in today's webinar, we will follow up as part of the information you receive tomorrow. If for any reason there's a disruption today and the technology fails us, we'll follow up with the webinar narrated for personal viewing after the session. Special acknowledgement to the Government of Canada, for which this webinar would not be possible without their support and funding. This work is part of TourismRecovery.ca initiative. TourismRecovery.ca was launched by Tourism HR Canada in June to help the sector respond to the COVID-19 crisis by providing timely information and practical tools at no cost. We'll learn about the website and information and tools that are available for free as we move through this session. Tourism businesses have asked us for webinars to help guide them through some of the big topics. Today is one of those topics. This will serve as our framework for today's webinar. It's a large topic with lots to cover. Again, we are being selective on what we can include, and there is much more on the website itself. When preparing for this session today, the team noticed that several of the messages across various platforms, all of our research, including stuff that's on our own site, all from different groups, were actually very similar in terms of the messaging. So this session is really a curation of that information. The 5 topics we'll look at in the order that we'll look at them include mindsets, the idea of marketing specifically, getting into the messaging, followed by methods, and finally measurement. So lots of M's to work with, but that should help us memorize the meaningful communication that we have for today. So the 5 M's are the framework. Let's get right into meaningful communication. Let's start with the big picture. Now, some of the principles and things to keep in mind about effective business communications here. So communication, as we all know, is the process of sharing information. It's about expressing ideas for a purpose. Most think about this as a verbal conversation, but it can include communicating in various ways, like the use of technology to transmit information, and even the use of body language or sign language or other examples. Effective business communication involves both internal and external stakeholders. The internal often would be characterized as employees, perhaps some of the direct shareholders. External tends to be a larger audience that could include customers, media, general public. A good reason for effective communications with internal stakeholders is to improve business practices, reduce errors, ensure people are following protocols to mitigate risk or prevent injury. Strong business communications in a company will likely result in higher employee engagement. One stat we came across indicated that companies with an engaged workforce see 19.2% growth in operating income over a 12-month period. And those with low engagement scores earn 32.7% less. Of course, communicating with those in the external category is also very important. External stakeholders are comprised of many different individuals and groups, all with unique perspectives on your business or the products and services you deliver. So this also tells us as a basic tenet that the ways in which we communicate with this audience is going to vary considerably, depending on the purpose or need. Briefly picking up on a message we had in each of the last 3 webinars, one of the key tenet here is the need to know who are your stakeholders. The more you know about them, and that includes current customers and post-pandemic or new target audiences you're seeking, the more you can appeal to their needs. We'll focus more on the consumer in this presentation. That is the external market. The next webinar, called Workforce Power Session, will pick up on the internal audience, that is the employees. And as the diagram shows you, the link between internal and external markets matter greatly when it comes to communications. So let's get to our first M, mindsets. Now to start, mindsets. This is really about acknowledging the various perspectives we all have. This is rooted in our culture, our experiences, and indeed other things. COVID has fundamentally changed our attitudes and behaviors. And this is based on the perspectives we have and the experiences we're facing. COVID is redefining how people interact, not only with each other, but also with the brands that surround them, the brands that in fact serve their needs. One of our source articles indicates that a crisis can be thought of as having 4 phases: the initial, the middle, the resolution, and recovery, each having a psychological and behavioral impact on target audiences. As a company, the goal is to journey through each phase alongside their customers and support them with carefully crafted programs designed to alleviate the psychological and behavioral tensions, thereby strengthening brand trust and resilience. That's a lot of jargon, but the real message here is we need to adapt our strategies to serve our customer needs, not just those that have been loyal to us, but new customers we need to go after. And we have to appeal to them in ways we have not done so before. Crisis communications must be responsive and ring true with honesty and transparency. Brands, or if you want to say companies, that are perceived as insincere or tone deaf in their response will lose customer confidence and trust and eventually be not useful in the marketplace. In other words, they can fail. Now, this article does say a few other things. I'm just going to state 2 more items from it. It goes on to say that target audiences are rarely homogeneous and during a crisis may fragment into multiple clusters, each with unique and different psychological and behavioral profiles. Again, very jargony, but keep in mind that we're in a volatile time. And the challenge that organizations face to tailor their messages is really something they need to think about carefully. They have to be sensitive to the particular needs of the different clients that they're serving while not alienating or offending others. And even if they are only contemplating a local vacation, consumers are still looking for places that are safe from infection. They're looking for places where they can relax and relieve stress. They're looking for access to open space and the outdoors. These are some of the psychological things and behavioral things that are informing what is occurring. Those themes, by the way, we picked up in our last webinar if you want to know more about them. Now, I'm only covering a few points here. Our website includes more detail on each of these stages, but it's a good backdrop for some of what is coming up. Let's start off with an example of perception for a moment. What do you see? For some, it's a young woman. For others, it's an old woman. It's really a matter of perspective. People can look at exactly the same thing, but see it entirely different. Now, I've highlighted here the nose, the chin, and the lips of the old woman. For some, that's what they saw. Others, however, might have seen the eye that's pointed out by the arrow, the ear, the chin, the necklace on the young woman. It's a good fun thing to do with children, by the way, if you have any. Oh, sorry, I meant to also add to this. There is another note here that's worth mentioning, and it's around the cultural differences, something that we are hearing much more about. Tourism businesses serve diverse markets and employ diverse workforces. Businesses and those they serve, their visitor must keep in mind that the cultural differences can cause misinterpretations, misperceptions, or even confusion. By realizing how different cultures might perceive and interpret the same nonverbal cues or visual cues, color, even images, they're better off to respond to the customer's needs and better target their product or service to meet their needs. So keep in mind, in terms of mindsets or perceptions, highly variable. Let's look at one more example. Is this a rabbit or is it a duck? Well, sometimes orientation matters. How you present the information can matter. Is this more clear? It's the same image. Quack, quack. Let's move on to the next M, marketing versus sales. Now, there is a difference between these two, and it's always worth a good reminder. Marketing, of course, is the business strategy to gain customers and to drive sales. Marketing is about understanding the marketplace. It is intended to help a company, a business, an organization see how it can modify its product, its services, its pricing, its communications, whatever its strategy is, so that it can attract new customers and help build sales. The goal of every business in the end is to sell something, whether it's a product, a service, or any other kind of information or what have you. The business sales, on the other hand, is really a focus on making the sale. It's for this reason that sales strategies and marketing strategies go hand in hand. Marketing aims to reach potential customers and to raise awareness of your products and services and their benefits. The sales strategy, on the other hand, aims to make the sale, to manage relationships with prospective customers, and to guide them to make the purchase. Now, that's a bit of a 101, but it's a good reminder because as you think about some of the strategies moving forward and the information contained on TourismRecovery.ca, when you think about these two categories, you see both how they're complementary, but how they have distinct features. I'm going to draw your attention to one of the checklists on the website called Develop Sales and Marketing Plan for New Markets. This checklist is a bit of back to the basics. It's the essential steps towards developing a sales and marketing plan. And the focus is on tapping into new markets, ones that you may not have considered in the past. COVID-19 has changed the playing field. For tourism businesses to survive and grow, they will need to quickly react to the profound changes in the economy. Businesses now must align products and services with new markets, respond to new regulations, mitigate risk associated with their supply chain, learn how to work with different staffing situations, recover from significant losses in revenues, and more. Tourism operators must revisit their business strategies to align their products and services with new and different markets. This checklist is a bit of a guidance tool on how to do that. To give you a little more insight on this, I've broken it down to the 8 key steps that the tool includes. We're going to walk through that fairly quickly. The first item on the checklist is to develop an organizational profile. This is pretty straightforward. If you sit down and think about it, It's really just about capturing information that you know well. Of course, the name, the address, the contact information, a bit about what is the vision and beliefs of the company. What are some of the goals and values? Now, you may not know all of this up front, or you may know it intuitively but never recorded it. Take some time to get it down. It helps a lot. But remember, when you're developing your profile, keep your target market in mind. Use plain language. Use wording that will be understood and meaningful to the market you're trying to attract. And if you've been operating with a certain profile for a while, ask yourself, is it still the same profile you want to maintain given the new markets you're trying to attract? The second item in our checklist gets at defining your overall marketing objectives. Now, for example, there's any number of reasons why you're going to want to do marketing. The slide contains several of these examples. Maybe it's really a focus on increasing your sales, or it's a focus on expanding into new markets. Maybe it's a focus on just trying to survive. Of course, it could be many things, but it's really important to write them down because this is going to be very important when it comes to the measurement of what you're doing and the strategies that you determine. When you're thinking about your marketing objectives, they really must be based on an understanding of your strengths, your weaknesses, and the overall business environment that you're in. We're going to come to a slide with a little more detail on that in a moment. And what we recommend, and is included in our material, is a focus at this time on the short-term strategy. With COVID, things are in flux a lot. We're not sure what it will look like in 6 months. We are hopeful, of course, but focusing on the short term for now matters greatly. And design things in your objectives that you know are realistic and you can achieve. This will help you take the right steps moving forward. As the markets grow, you'll be prepared to also extend your marketing objectives and to think more long term. The next step in our checklist goes on to describing products and services. So of course, when you reflect on items 1 and 2 that you've recorded, it makes you think about what types of products and service offer you might focus on. And to do so, there's some good questions to ask yourself. Examples of those are on the screen. Just what do you think that market would like? How would that be different than competition? How would you describe that as a value proposition? It'll help you narrow in or focus on what it is that you think will be viable and successful. Moving on to the next step on this checklist is around getting a little more detail on understanding who the market is you're appealing to. There's a lot of ways to look at this, but generally some characteristics focus on these 4 things. First of all, where do these people live? How far are they from your business? Are they local? Are they from another corner of the planet? Of course, at the moment, we have no option but to think about it more from a domestic or local market, and we'll get into that in a moment. When you think about demographic or socioeconomic profile, it's really just another way of saying, what do you think is the income level or the education level or the kind of ethnic groups that are included, or even perhaps religious affiliations or age categories? The psychographic profile is really what you think their beliefs and values are, their interests are. And what motivates them? Is it a family holiday? Is it a business event? What is it? Now, this stuff is always stuff that you can do some research around to get a real strong handle on it and get a little more scientific with it. But it might also just be something that you are building from your current knowledge of those markets or your experience with them. You can make this as formal and informal as you like, but it's very important to try to get a handle on who these people are. Your whole strategy is going to be building with the view that you're targeting this particular audience. Not everybody, but a target audience. That will help you succeed more carefully. To help build your strategy, though, it also involves outlining threats and opportunities. This is where I'm going to remind you of a presentation slide we had from Strategic Planning for Business Continuity. The pestle analysis is very similar to what we've included on this checklist, which looks at social cultural factors like what's the demand for the products, what are their social needs, what are the different attitudes they may have, or the technology factors like is there a need for automation on this, Is there a growing demand for things like big data? And the list of questions is included in there so you can think through these and help you get a better handle on what kinds of things would be impediments to trying to move forward with your thinking or are opportunities. This is not that complicated. The questions around a dinner table or sitting down with your partners around a coffee table, of course, with the proper social distance protocols in place, can help you market and nail this information and give you a better perspective. Every effort you have to document this gets you closer to realizing your plan. The next item, of course, then gets you a little more directive on building on the knowledge you've had from 1 through 5 and actually getting you to define just what you're going to offer. And you can reflect a bit on how different that is to what you were offering and begin to think a little more carefully about things like price points and other details. Finally, it's important when you're thinking about your developing your sales and marketing plan to also think about contingency plans, especially in COVID times when we understand the changes we're faced with. It's important to deal with the different potential challenges and to think about what they mean. Brush up, find out, are there new regulations you need to follow? Are there different preferences out there? What are some of the competitors working on? What about the staff? Can you take for granted you're going to have the right people, the right skills, or even enough of them? So things are different than they were pre-COVID. Look around you. Get a sense of what you need to focus on in terms of potential contingencies. Make a plan. Decide how you're going to tackle some of these things if they should arise. Finally, the last stage in the checklist is about implementing your plan. Here too, I don't want this to look too complicated. It's not. Just a little chart like what you see at the bottom of this slide is as simple as it can be. You just got to write down the things you know you got to act on. Let's call them tasks. And then you're going to have to look at, well, how are we going to get them done? That's the resources. Just think about the people you need, or maybe the tools, or the kind of financing that's required. And then when you reflect on all those, decide how you act on it. Does it need a budget? And finding who's going to be the person responsible or people responsible. So this is not complicated, and you don't have to get it all right, but record as many as you can. Start on your implementation by tackling the things you can do well with the resources you have, and then build your way up as you succeed with some of the activities. I'll draw your attention to one more of the worksheets, but I'm not going to go through this in any detail. It is another related one to the topic we were just covering. It's called Tapping into New Visitor Markets. We also featured this very briefly in one of the previous webinars. Basically, there are 3 main sections in here. It's about defining who your visitor market is. It's getting to know a little bit more about your target market and to know more about your competition. There are other details, but that's a little more detail than what we had in the previous checklist if you want to focus in on getting a better understanding of the markets you can go after. The subtitle of this one is called Focusing on the Domestic Traveler, and of course there's a good reason for that. With COVID, we've all had to look more close to home, and enticing the domestic market is very much what it means for survival today. What do we mean by that? Well, pre-COVID, the real strategy was to expand our global reach. Our federal government, many businesses were looking at their export readiness of their products. The more we attracted international visitors, the stronger it was for our industry. But COVID has contracted that. We are losing ground. It got to be a narrower and narrower market, or I prefer to say a more focused market. And the words local market became much more part of our vocabulary. But what do we mean by that? Well, on a general term, it's really the domestic market to start off with. But still, there are some restrictions, and travel is not always possible across jurisdictions, or if it is, it's not without some challenges, like having to quarantine for 2 weeks and matters of that type. So although we can travel within the Canadian context, it still might mean that we're talking about a more local market for many. So what is local? Well, just to narrow in more specifically, it's often defined by what's in your neighborhood, I'm going to say. Or more carefully, if we use Kitchener-Waterloo as the center of our universe here, for an example, you can think about it from a neighborhood point of view, or start looking at who can meet you, who can you can attract that would be able to enter your businesses within a day trip, perhaps overnight, perhaps short stays. And you can start to think a little bit more about longer stays if you have people thinking about driving for more hours than that. An example we had of that as well was the Atlantic bubble. But unfortunately, just yesterday, the bubble burst. So it was a good example, and we can hope that we'll see more of these bubbles emerge. It's an example of how we can come out of the pandemic. Local markets are about staying close to home and gradually expanding when it's possible. These markets are often different than what the ones were that you were catering to previously, or they were part of your mix, but they weren't your sole focus. And even then, you have to remember, customers' mindsets have evolved and changed. That's why we started with that thinking for a moment. What they wanted in the past could be very different than what they're looking for today. So let's move on to our next M, messaging. Well, messaging really starts off with a discussion about brand. It's very much connected to your brand. The brand, after all, is the voice of your company. David Ogilvy, who's quoted on here, is considered the grandfather of brand. At least that's what the literature tells me. And we looked for a definition, but basically every time you look for a definition on brand, it says it's hard to define and there's no singular definition. But I'm going to use David's definition: a person's perception of a product, service, experience, or organization. There's that word perception again, or that idea of mindset. And really what it gets into is a realization that every brand that's out there is perceived uniquely by each consumer. So brands are personal and they are dynamic. They do evolve. They evolve with what you're doing. They evolve with what's happening in the market. Brands elicit feelings. So those traits you see on the screen are very much part of the sort of characteristics of what define a brand to a large extent. And although this may be amorphous or hard to define for some, I think many of you know what a brand is because you are loyal to them, or of course you help manage a brand. So just what is your brand saying about your company? And is it still speaking to the market that you aim to attract? Is it still addressing the needs in current times, indeed also moving forward? Brands may also have to adapt, just like we have to adapt our communications. This is a quote from a Forbes article. There's no one way to know how long this pandemic will last, they go on to say. We need to keep communicating and operating and adapting to the ways we do both. This is what we will see through the other side of the crisis, and this is what will help us come out stronger. There is, of course, some key points that they mention in this article, 3 in particular. 1, break it down. Basically, make the message easy to understand. Start with acknowledging the situation and how we need to validate the feelings of our audience. And avoid overused phrases like unprecedented times or times of uncertainty. These will lose their meaning because they're overused and can become trite. You can regain meaning by finding something that's more personal and more aligned with your brand. Things like, we are concerned about the future, say a similar message, but are far more personal. Another example they have in there, of course, is adapting the way we communicate during a business crisis is, what I was going to say here is that what we're starting to see, and you probably are picking up already, is that some of these messages are very similar that we've seen from now a few sources, all in response to brand. And we're going to see more of this as we're going through this. We're going to see more of this theme of the caring for the consumer. I'm at the communications tab. I wanted to show you this for a moment because it just helps me pick up a few items related to this category we're in. Within this section alone, as I scroll down, I just want to highlight for you what you can pick up on. Some of these are featured briefly in today's presentation. So for example, there is a section on COVID signage, or preparing key messages, or mapping your stakeholder universe, which is that sort of area of how to define who you serve, etc., or PR strategies to help manage the crisis. I'm going to get into that one in a little more detail now to give you a feel for what it contains. Basically, all businesses face a crisis at some point. We certainly are experiencing that. And few industries are more affected by this current pandemic than the global travel and tourism industry. Throughout this period, effective crisis PR will be essential in ensuring continued reassurance and confidence, and to secure confidence of your stakeholders. So our website contains 5 important response strategies. 1, forecasting and monitoring as a priority. You cannot effectively respond to a crisis if you're not properly informed by it or you're taken by surprise. You must be as proactive as possible in forecasting crises on the horizon. Identify who is commenting on the situation, who the main voices are in the public square. Ensure you have the capacity to effectively analyze and impact what's happening so that you can respond appropriately. Another item we have is to understand the issues before you respond. This is going to take a little bit of work. Both individuals and organizations are pressured to respond. You need to take some time to understand what the issues really are. Engage in dialogue with as many informed stakeholders as you can. Consult experts. Be aware of conflicting points of view. Do your research. All of this matters greatly. There's a lot of misinformation out there, as we well know. Getting to know what is right matters, especially in a time of crisis, and particularly when there's protocols you must follow to manage people's health and safety. Another PR strategy is to focus on essential things. As we say in the article, it can be tempting to share every detail during a crisis. While this may convey openness and honesty, information overload can be unhelpful or even frightening for your stakeholders. That's the last thing you want, is to instill panic. It's best to provide the right amount of information directly that's relevant to the audience that you're trying to respond to. And of course, be honest. We don't want misinformation. The facts tend to emerge eventually if you are not honest. Taking a dishonest stance is always an extreme risk. Your stakeholders will forgive errors, but they will not forgive dishonesty. And finally, we have to learn from every crisis. It's not just about weathering the current crisis, but improving on your response for the next one. Remember, this pandemic, although very difficult, is actually one time in history when we can learn how better to manage through different crises over time. And this industry is going to be affected with it for different reasons, whether it's weather issues or other factors. So being better prepared means we'll have more resilience in the long term. Moving a little forward on this, the same website includes some further strategy guidance on the PR strategies, a little more detail. And here the website includes guidance on creating a crisis communications plan. Now, a crisis communication plan is basically a set of guidelines used to prepare a business for an emergency or an unexpected event. And these plans include steps to help take when a crisis first emerges. How many of you had these plans in place prior to this pandemic? Are you acting on them? Do they work? Would it have made a difference if you would have had them? This plan includes steps to take when your crisis first emerges, how to communicate with your stakeholders, and how you might address or prevent reoccurrences in the future. So there's quite a bit of detail in here, but quickly, there are strategies around 5 key areas. 1, how you respond to your communication needs. Lots of crisis communication plans are focused on one key message, and that is have a good communicator who will be the key spokesperson that speaks all the messages to the public. You might notice this when you're watching TV, that there are central communicators that respond to items. They need to be someone who is trusted over time, and then people will also know that they focus on the messages from that person. You also need to think about proactive damage control. Even if things may appear to be going well for the time being, you should always be prepared for the crisis to occur or some deviation of it. So proactive damage control is what you do to reduce or prevent the effects of the crisis before it occurs. For example, it's having certain systems in place for physical distancing efforts or at home working, and other things that you might do just to try to prevent things from occurring, mitigate the issues. You should also have within your plan case escalation. This is all about how to resolve emergency issues in a crisis situation between the affected parties before they reach a larger audience. Basically, this is about customer service escalation and how to diffuse an issue before it gets out of hand. Many can relate to this on basic levels, like dealing with a customer complaint, but we have to think bigger and on issues that are more complex. We also need to be prepared with the social media response. It's an indispensable tool for travel and tourism businesses to keep lines of communication open in times of crisis. And social media is really the key platform that's going to help you get the information out broadly. It's also where most of your market will go to find information. And finally, our strategies get into talking about customer feedback, collection and analysis to give you an idea of whether the things you're doing are actually helping address the needs. And also, if there are other things that you should be doing. There are, of course, other things that the communication plan includes, and there are some basics of communication, the so-called 5 C's. So yeah, we have 5 M's, now we've got 5 C's. By the way, we won't be talking about the 5 P's in case you're wondering. But anyway, 5 C's. Whatever practical approaches you take to crisis communications, you'll also need to consider the style and tone of the communication. The most important thing for your business is to remain in stable control of the communications and how it comes across. So these 5 C's, which we define in the website, are the things to keep in mind. Concerns focus on the needs and concerns of the audience. Clarity is about making sure that you're factual and honest. Control is really about making sure your message is controlled. Confidence is about speaking with confidence and assurance. And competence, similarly, is about conveying that you're able to handle the situation competently. Again, similar messages we've seen from many sources. One I'm going to draw your attention to is BDC, who in one article summarized a lot of the same points with 3 key things. Put people first, manage your concerns, and nurture your brand. That's a bit jargony in my mind, but it contains a lot of the same depth of information. Moving forward, I'm going to go to one more site that had some good tips. It's from Mckenzie. And here it's about communicating with teams and stakeholders during COVID. Now, this was written some time ago in the early part of COVID, but it still rings true. So superior crisis communicators tend to do 5 things well, they go on to say. 1, they give people what they need when they need it. They communicate clearly, simply, frequently. They use candor over charisma. Trust is never more important than in a crisis. Be honest about where things stand. They revitalize resilience. This is described as the health crisis metasizes into economic crisis, accentuate the positive and strengthen communal bonds to restore confidence. Did you catch that? I'm going to repeat it because it's jargony, but as the health crisis metasizes into an economic crisis, accentuate the positive and strengthen communal bonds to restore confidence. Yeah, you can mull that one over for a while. And finally, they go on to say, distill meaning from chaos. The crisis will end. Help people make sense of how all that happened. Establish a clear vision or mantra for how the organization will emerge and serve its customers. Similar points are also captured on TourismRecovery.ca. If I bring you back to that site for a moment, I've captured for you here what we have curated from several sites on tone of messages and on some key points. I am not going to repeat some of these messages. The site contains descriptors of these things, but you can see they pick up on a lot of the similar messages we've learned from the last few. But let me show you now what that looks like when we see some examples. Destination Canada. Now, these very themes are picked up in a recent publication that DC put out. I think this was published just on November 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, and it's downloadable from their website. Let's take a brief look at it. Basically, there are 4 items on their 12-page guide, very easy item for you to follow. And in there's messages on how to stay informed, how to emphasize safety, adapt to your business needs, and embrace other seasons. This is really about the local market thing. And they, of course, include some practical items in there, like tips for creating COVID-conscious content. There's another way of describing some of the things we've looked at already in just a few of the previous slides. Some key messages that they recommend you include. Indeed, there are people following this guidance, or examples of it, just drawing from a simple capture of a website here and looking at Marriott Bonvoy, just picking up on one message they have in their banner, which I think we see in many people's websites, immediately draw a consumer to what they're doing around assurances of safety, security, and specific protocols that you can link to. So this is something that is very much pandering to the needs that consumers have that are both psychological and socially based. Another example of that, simple, straightforward one, again from a website. Another way to look at it, but they're highlighting how they're managing safety during COVID to make it accessible. Let's use a different example. As COVID-19 continues, there is one thing for sure, that none of us are really quite sure just how long this will last. And there's a sense of isolation, and we've all had to adapt to more solitary existence. This ad by Guinness played off of that idea. Since the start of the lockdown, consumer circumstances and buying habits changed, and brands have also had to change to meet those needs. Their operational approaches also had to change, as did their messages and so on. Many brands opted to remain conservative or play it safe. Some were more creative. Now here's an interesting one from Guinness. The message is stay home. But what is also part of this is how they can deliver to your home. So it's interesting how they focus on it. Now the next one I'm going to go to is closer to home, and it has to do with work done from the Chateau the Chateau in Banff. Now look, there is the Banff Springs Hotel here has done a really interesting job. I'm going to attempt to link directly to YouTube and have this play. Now this is a bit of an experiment. I may lose everybody, but let's give this a try, and hopefully we will succeed. This is well worth the viewing pleasure, let me tell you. Go to YouTube. It's coming up. If it takes too long, I'll have to give up on this one, but let's hope. Okay. Now, I'm going to play this, and hopefully you can see it and hear it. So I don't know if that worked well. I got messages that we didn't see that. I apologize for that, but now I hope that I am back on and you can see it. Listen, it's well worth the trip to go check out this video. It is really an exemplary piece of work in terms of how the Banff Springs Hotel launched a campaign called The Art of Waiting. And really the game here was to make sure that people kept them in mind, but also understood the challenges they were facing. There's a series of mini videos that they have. If there's nothing else you do after this presentation, it's to go and check that out. Sorry about that, I gave it a try, didn't work, we'll move forward. Okay, now one more thing about signage is interesting. There's a lot of fun things happening out there, but we have to be careful that you line this up with your brand and that you're also very careful with the signage. Some of the things on this screen you might have come across. One, I'm going to highlight the guy that's in the circle. This was recently in the media. I think many of you would have heard about it. It was highlighted in Colbert, in one of the late night TV shows. This, of course, was used in British Columbia as part of the signage in a public transportation item. But the big notice here is that it looked like something other than a mask on this guy's face. So, you know, be careful with these things when you're thinking about being a little creative and interesting. But meanwhile, others have used some interesting messages to get across things that will line up with their brand and really appeal to consumers. Some of those examples are on the screen. And as a matter of interest for those, I was Googling a few things. This El Araro place has been putting up a whole series of really fantastic signs like this. So go check it out. That's just for fun. We'll move on to our next item. So related to a message around communications that we saw in a previous slide, we might as well do more on the series of C's. There are other business communication essentials that go along with the way you communicate. But first, the 7 C's on effective communication are a place to start. These are, of course, that you have to be clear, make sure that it's clear, that you're clear about your message, your goal, that the message is understood by your market. I always think avoiding jargon and using plain language helps. Sorry about this. Being concise so that people are not reading on forever, but rather you're getting to your message briefly and succinctly, and so on. I'm not going to read all these, but these are the similar methods that we've concluded on our website that you've seen in a number of others. And they're important to keep in mind, however you might be communicating. Now, with that in mind, I wanted to draw you to another tool that I think is really a smart one that's available from Destination British Columbia. Now, here off their website, you can go and download this information. They have a mechanism here about how to define and measure paid, owned, and earned media. So they describe owned media as the kinds of web properties you see, earned media as things that are shared, paid media, which includes primarily advertising of different forms. But what's lovely about this tool is it really helps you focus in on the strategies that you should employ. In fact, most tourism businesses do require a fairly sophisticated social media strategy. So these 3 areas really help you think about the different types of media to focus on. And indeed, it shows the value propositions of what it means when these intersect and how to work with it. And fundamentally, how this leverages what you're doing as part of your marketing strategy. Now, I could probably spend one webinar on this alone, but I encourage you to go to Destination British Columbia's website, where they do have this in some detail. But what they also have, which I'm sure most of you will be very interested in, is a self-audit tool called Is Your Business Digitally Ready? And what's lovely about this is you can quickly discover just how well you fare on these matters and others, and give you a bit of a structure to move forward on how you would think about your media options. So that is one of the main means of how you can anticipate how you'll deliver your communications. Another tool to go to, I mentioned BDC earlier. BDC has been doing some very good work, publicly available information, particularly aimed at small businesses, on how to tackle COVID-19 issues. I find that some of their topics are a little light compared to some of the material on our site, but nonetheless, there's strong tools in here and things I would strongly recommend you go to. Notice that I've highlighted that you're in the articles and tools section. And here I pulled up the thing on sales and marketing. And there are basically 3 key things that they include in here. They include external communications plans, basically what to say to your customers, how to manage your brand. They include how to adapt to your marketing plans, and finally, how to ramp up your digital. So they do include some key tips that are familiar to what you've seen in this presentation. A little less detail, but they are examples of where you might start for sure. It's free, it's downloadable, and there's lots of information contained in there. This is an example of one of the items in the guide about managing and trusting your brand. And you'll notice some of the messages here again are consistent with what we saw with all the other sources. Being empathetic, being honest, being sure that you're direct and sincere, and so on. They include some key things on e-commerce, which is of course a key delivery element to consider. Finally, I'm going to move on to a little more information from something we've adapted from something called tourismschool.com. And although this is from 2016, there are a number of things here that still resonate today. And it's interesting to look at this because it's way pre-COVID. Everything else I've showed you has been COVID, but sort of spurred on by COVID activity. Yet there's many things in here that are consistent with how you should tackle your media and marketing strategies. This article that we have included as part of today's deck does include a few more tips than what you see on here, but I put it up just to give you an idea of some of the things that are consistent with good practice. Related to this is 5 tips to stay afloat during COVID. And again, messages are similar. First of all, reassure your customers. Keep the calm tone. Use a positive message. Use relevant language. Be creative. Maybe not as creative as some of those previous slides showed, but think about what it lines up with your brand. It's time to take a few risks to make sure that you get your voice out there. They use the term kick up on social. And what reads directly here, even before the coronavirus started, social media was king. To market your business on social, be active, be present. Join conversations, utilize sponsorship posts or paid advertisements, be more frequent, etc. Build relationships virtually. When communicating and connecting with customers during the coronavirus, be empathetic, be genuine, be thoughtful, and improve your online presence. So now it's starting to sound a little redundant to things I've said, but what's interesting is that many sources have similar messages. So hopefully these resonate and are helping you think carefully about how you're working and if you're doing the same. So the last M today is around measurement. So what are we talking about here? Just what are you measuring? Well, remember we started this with defining what your goals are or what your objectives were around your marketing and sales strategy. In a way, measurement is simply reflecting on those goals and asking yourself, are we meeting them? Those goals could vary and they could have meant several things. For example, maybe you were just trying to build awareness for now, a bit like what Banff Springs did, awareness that they're still around, that their doors are open, that they're eager to have you come back. Of course, it has other motivations, but that is one of the key objectives they had. Or maybe it's about trying to attract your new customers, that new market. Are you actually getting those people in the doors as you had intended? Are they buying your products or services? What about your new platform you're delivering on? Is your e-commerce working? So these are all part of what you would have defined up front. Your goal then, of course, is to get a measure on whether it's working. A lot of that is simply tracking your activities, reflecting on it, deciding whether it's making any sense, and adapting and changing your practices if it's not. One other thing I can raise here as an example has to do strictly with the social media piece, since it's become a major factor in most strategies. Obviously, one way of measuring whether you're successful there is to collect the data on impressions, on clicks, on video views, and so on. If you're not doing that, then you have to start. This is stuff that's readily available, gives you an idea of whether you're getting traction, helps you think about where you need to adapt, gives you some clue on who's checking it out. Are you connecting with your right target audience? So we've gone through the 5 M's. That's a lot of content to cover. And of course, I'm going to draw you back to our website for a moment. There is much more information. Tourism HR Canada has several tabs where you may want to go. I always highlight this particular one where I'm pulling down the labor market information and referring to the Tourism Employment Tracker tool. It's one of the most used tools we have at the moment. It gives you an idea of what's happened to date, but also projections moving forward as late as 2025 to give you a feel for what it means in the workforce, but there are other indicators on how it impacts financially. Check out our news section, which is where the newsletter information and blog is contained. Of course, the COVID-19 site, many of you are aware of. It's a curated site that includes links to some of the more practical tools to help you manage workforce issues, and of course includes links to relief programs and more. If you're not subscribed to our newsletter that comes out every second Wednesday, I encourage you to do so. That's where we keep you up to date with the most current information and always feature some of the most current data and links to things like this webinar. TourismRecovery.ca, of course, is the main site we've been talking about. This site is going to continue to evolve based on demands and interests of the market. Please check it out. Let us know if it's working for you. We want to hear from you. If there's other things that you would like to see in there, do let us know. In fact, the webinars are an example of that. People have asked us to produce these, and we've picked up on the very themes that were prioritized. Remember, there's downloadable forms, links to other sites, and some of the most current information. The 2020 webinar series has already had 4 sessions. If you would like to view any of the previous sessions, they are available on our website. Again, you'll get that link tomorrow as a follow-up. And we look forward to seeing you on December 9th for the last of our 2020 webinar series before we break for the new calendar year. And that will be on the Workforce Power session. On behalf of the board, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Again, a PDF copy and the recorded session is available on our website should you want to revisit this or share it with others. On behalf of Tourism HR Canada, our staff, our board, we wish you a safe and healthy season. Remember, it's only 1 month through Christmas, so if you haven't started shopping, you should start panicking. And finally, the 3 W's. We'll leave you with wash your hands, wear a mask, and watch your distance. Thank you again.